I'm Nicola Talent and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts. I don't know, I think it must be one of the hardest jobs in the world to be a prison officer and to be dealing with people who are just, first of all, living in such unnatural circumstances. They're locked up, their movements are restricted. It must be so high octane, and I'm sure every day somebody lashes out.
Yeah, look at the last Prison Officers Association General Conference there earlier this year. I mean, they talked about the number of assaults were up. I mean, part of that was, I think, the things were a bit quieter, believe it or not, during lockdown, during COVID. And so there was a bit of a surge again as more drugs got back into the prison. But yeah, I mean, like some of the guys that I've met over the years and women, doing that job, like the ones who seem to last at it are very calm sort of characters. Like they don't rise quickly.
Yeah.
They're easygoing. They come across as easygoing, but there's very much it's about respect. And I think no more than in the old days it would have been very different. There would have been, I guess, a certain amount of institutional violence that would have been tolerated. But nowadays it isn't. And everything is on camera, and so prison officers, and they always did. The majority of them always did. Are playing by the rules, and it's probably better for them as well as for the prisoners. But yeah, without a doubt, I mean, a lot of people are in prison because they have behavioural problems, because they lash out and can't control their emotions. They're impulsive,
and probably because they have some mental health problems. There's no doubt about that. Some of them shouldn't be, maybe in the prison system.
Any of the prison officers that you speak to will tell you that there's so many people that just really should be somewhere else and not in prison.
Yeah.
Which in some cases can bring its own issues. That you might have people with mental health issues who ends up there and are introduced to harder drugs than they might have had access to before. So you can
are put in dangerous, high octane situations every day where they could be, if they're argumentative, they could be, now I know they try and keep people apart that have issues with each other, and they try and keep like with like on certain wings and all the rest of it. But like Alan Wilson is a guy that I wouldn't like to be coming up close with on a daily basis. He is a very dangerous criminal, a hitman for hire, and part of a family that had left their mark really on gangland when it comes to assassinations. He's a cousin of John Wilson, Eric Lucky Wilson, and Luke Wilson. And he also he was acquitted in relation to the murder of the teenager Mariora Rostas, but he has been jailed because of a conspiracy to murder a rival of the Kinahan faction. He was working as a hitman for hire by the Kinahans. And he's known as a kind of a very strange, unusual character. He was nicknamed the Soldier because of the way he holds himself and carries himself. I've seen him myself up fairly close in a courtroom, and he's really strange, really sort of a sinister, small character, but obviously has an ability to fly off the handle at any time.
Yeah, and I think you add to that he's very much a marked man in prison, and it's something that he mentioned in a High Court case when he was looking to get a transfer out of Mountjoy, where he felt he was at risk. He was talking about how there was graffiti in the prison, that his concerns weren't being taken seriously, and he wanted to get to the Midlands Prison. So that was, I think, 2 or 3 years ago. So just last week, then we ran the story that he was in the Midlands, and there had been a group of whatever prison officers on that particular landing, according to the information that we got. And it would change over as part of the I think a natural cycle. It was a different group were being kind of I suppose assimilated in or whatever to take over duties and whatever part of the landing he was on. He was very much he's not in isolation, but he's kind of kept away from a lot of other prisoners, as much for their own sake as his sake. And he didn't recognize, he didn't like these strange new people coming in, according to what I've been told. And that he was very much, he just lashed out. And so, again, so it's far from the first time. He's had quite a number of what they call P19s.
At the prison officers.
Yeah, he lashed out at the prison officers. So, like, the plan then was, I think they were going to move him out then to the high security Portlaoise prison, which is next door to the Midlands, but it is a separate prison. And obviously, presumably he'll be in, the A landing, which is where a lot of the gangland people are. But they're very much more controllable there. It's a brand new prison wing. There's ways that they can, they're going to spend less time, meeting other people. And, so sometimes it's as much to give the prisoner who is suffering a breakdown or whatever, it's to give them a break, as well as, I suppose, staff as well, to give them a chance.
So what happens if a prisoner like Alan Wilson just loses it? And I mean, that has to be unexpected. You know what I mean? He obviously the cell wasn't being searched or anything. It was a simple changeover of staff from one shift to the next, and he just loses it. How do they handle that, and what do they do?
I suppose it works in different ways. It depends on I suppose, the severity of the situation. I mean, if you have, like, at the highest end of the scale, like, a control and restraint team is brought in, which is, at the very minimum, I think it's 5 officers in their protective gear, helmets, and one will carry a shield, and it's basically to try and subdue the prisoner by, pull them up against the wall or the door or the floor or whatever. And then they're carried out. There's somebody holding their head to stop them, hurting themselves, banging their head off the wall. There's a person on each leg. It's called the Parlini method, I believe, after, the notorious prison in Scotland where the violence is so bad, they had to come up with new ideas. You couldn't just have prisoners and prison officers fighting each other all day long, because, it was just, nobody can live like that.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's at the top end. And presumably in those cases, then they'll be they'll be left in, a padded cell until such point.
Do they have padded cells still?
Yeah, of course they do. Yeah. And they'll have kind of tear-free blankets, so people can't can't use something to turn into a ligature so they could strangle themselves or whatever. So that is still used. I mean, and they're used as much for observation. Again, it's usually, it's not necessarily, seriously violent gangsters like Alan Wilson. It's awfully, really deeply troubled souls who are suffering, amazing levels of mental anguish and breakdown,
self-harm.
And who end up there.
I was up in Belfast working there a couple of weeks ago, and I popped into the Crumlin Road jail on my way down just to have a little look and a tour. I've been somewhere I've been meaning to go. They do a fantastic tour around it, actually, which is about 90
You look quite happy
minutes.
on your pictures that you put up on Twitter.
I was delighted myself. But
you'd be that happy to be
I
in prison.
actually find jails really interesting. Like the one down in Wicklow as well is very
haunted. The haunted Wicklow jail.
Well, like the Victorians were so tiny compared to us. Like we are just giant creatures compared to them. So like all the doors are, you're not practically knocking your head going in. I'm not massively tall, but it's interesting to see the scale of everything that was built back then, and to stand inside a cell and to try and imagine what it would be like to be in there. I mean, the Crumlin Road jail was open for more than 150 years. So you have the kind of the history of the Victorian times, and they bring you all around and show you all that. And the women were put into prison. Kids were put into these prison cells, and they were lashed, and they were, for any misdemeanor, they were fed on gruel. How they survived is beyond me. There was obviously no heating in it. And then that prison was used throughout the Troubles, was only closed in 1996. So you have all the sort of the stories of the prisoners, the ones that were interned, and those then that were jailed later on, the famous escapes and how they happened, and the various characters. So it's fascinating, sort of journey through history, but they bring you right back to when they used to hang people, like for, murder was the one that obviously the most serious crime, and they used to hang people at one point outside the jail, and people would come from all over the countryside with their picnic blankets and their food and their drink and everything, and they would have this massive big party as someone was hung, and that's where the word hangover came from. The next day.
No Netflix, I guess you had to do something.
Yeah, true. You had to do something.
And the likes of Mountjoy and Portlaoise and Limerick are all from that era.
I'm sure, obviously there's still prisoners in them, so you can't get your tour around them. But Kilmainham is interesting. It's as well, like, I mean, it is obviously highly political, and it's all about the story of Dublin and the fight and the rising and everything. But they're just, the general day-to-day running of the prisons is fascinating. And in a way, I got onto that because when you said about the padded cell, there is a padded cell in the Crumlin Road jail, and you can look in it now. It looks really comfy. It looks like a kind of a sort of a place that if you were a little bit,
get one here for you.
Going,
like,
yeah, but if you could roll it round, it's like a cloud. But obviously, it's pretty horrific if you're in there with the door closed. But it's spongy, like it is exactly what you'd see on the television. And of course, they also have this system where they used to move prisoners, dangerous, volatile prisoners, move them slower. So they'd sort of open one gate and then let them into this area, lock that gate and then open the next one. I'm sure there's a name for that when they're moving them around from one part of the prison to the next, that they don't just walk them straight through. They sort of walk them in bits so as they can't, so they're always locked in a cage basically on their journey.
I suppose to keep control, to keep someone in detention.
So he will move now, and what? Does he go into isolation now because he's...
Well, it'll depend. Like, I mean, sometimes what they'll do is they'll transfer someone away for 2 or 3 months and then bring them back to the prison where they're serving their lengthy sentence, whatever, because they already might be involved in an educational setup or whatever, or, have supports or whatever it is that are needed there. And so governors, I guess, have to balance their own resources. So if you've got new prisoners, and a particularly troublesome one, it's going to take up a lot more of your resources. So you're quite happy to give them back to where they came from.
Yeah.
There is a national violence reduction unit where, there's been some particularly dangerous inmates have gone, and that's also part of kind of the same campus as part of the Midlands campus. And it would be very much senior prison officers and psychologists who would staff that. And the whole point there is to try and is to understand the triggers that might set these guys off, and also to try and see if these guys can ever gain any kind of insight into what triggers them as well. So there's all that kind of effort being put in to try and control the violence, because you can't just keep battering people like day in, day out every time there's a flare up. So I mean, there is that kind of, but you're only talking about 5 or 6 people at any one time in there. So, I mean, and Alan Wilson isn't there. I mean, and there's plenty of other people, I'm sure, in the system who aren't too far off that mark. I mean...
Wilson's suing the prison service.
Yeah, he was claiming that that his concerns about the attacks and threats against him weren't being taken seriously, and he was stabbed, and he had I think a fairly serious cut across his head. He was badly beaten by, I think, and it was being put down to the Kinahan cartel trying to get revenge on him for whatever reason. But I mean, with someone like Wilson, you'd imagine he'd have so many enemies, it'd be really hard to figure out which one is exactly after him. But he was claiming there was it was 20,000 bounty for him to be cut, and 100,000 if he was killed. Did
he give any explanation as to why? Because he had information about the Kinahan cartel. They thought he was going to be sharing that, or
presumably, again, there must have been some issue there that there was some idea that he may have betrayed them, or that he was getting blamed for
their very nature,
failure.
They fall in and out of these groups all the time, don't they? Particularly somebody like Wilson, who was essentially freelance. He wasn't really actually associated with the Kinahan cartel until he was caught working for them, but he would have taken $1 from anybody.
Yeah, and we saw that in the fact that, I mean, he's serving his 8-year sentence for the plot against Gary Hanley. But in the midst of that, while he was under surveillance by the guards, he was boasting about his part in the Players' Lounge attack previously in 2010. And so he was sentenced for that previous crime after the Gary Hanley plot and got 10 years for that. So he'd hoped to get that backdated so that he would have actually been out fairly soon or already. But he lost that case as well, and his release date's about 2029 or something like that.
And he's been in since 2017.
Yeah, and he was very much, the stuff he was, like, he denied it was him on the kind of the surveillance tape, but he was talking about how you know, it's amazing how these guys survive even when you put a bullet in their head. Like, he was quite, you know, he was quite open about it. And of course he was saying, look, it wasn't me, or else I was just bragging, trying to make myself look good. And the video footage of it.
He's very talkative, actually. He's a bit of a dowdle. I was listening to the surveillance tapes they recorded him and others when they were circling Gary Hanley, attempting to shoot him. They never got around to it, and it was a chaotic kind of a hit team that often slept in, and it was the biggest, I think it was the longest investigation like that the guards had ever invested in, but it paid off. They were all eventually caught, but they had bugs in their cars, and he was chatting away about everything. I mean, and jumping, I've said this before, but I found it really sinister because they were jumping from one subject to the next. Like, I mean, it reminded me of, they were bored, right? They're sitting in a surveillance vehicle. How many times have you or I been in that situation, sitting there with a photographer and you're talking about all sorts of shite to put in the day, like, you know? And that's what it was like with them. But they were talking, they were 1 minute, they were jumping from giving out about the kids or what movies they were watching on the television to, you know, what drinks they liked. Actually, at one point, this sort of group of transition year students came in just as they were explaining how to drink Captain Morgan's with orange, and it tasted like a Solero. And I was like, it's very inappropriate. These children listening to this, giving them ideas, when actually they were also talking about murder. But yeah, and they'd flip from that into kind of discussing Gary Hanley and that what they were going to do with the money they got for killing him, and they were hoping to get it done by Christmas so they'd have the money for Christmas presents. I mean, it's just bizarre listening to that kind of discussion.
Yeah, cold-blooded.
Cold-blooded. Really. Like, I mean, it is literally just another day's work for them. Nonetheless, all the prison officers and the warders that keep these guys quiet, I think, deserve a shout out, because it's not a job I certainly think I could do. I don't know about yourself.
Yeah, no, well, I do think that the level of professionalism is light years ahead of what it was, you know, 30, 40 years ago. I mean, like all government departments, you know, it has its issues. You know, the POA conference, you know, the guys are complaining about, you know, lack of pay, complain about the lack of communication from management when there's changes and all that kind of stuff. And you know, and there is, you know, there's more and more people ending up, like the numbers inside are creeping up. It was dropping for a little while. You know, there's some good ideas have come in like over the years. Like, I know there's these scanners now that are stopping pieces of paper, photographs that have been infused with drugs, and that was very successful. You know, they've had a number of successes in some prisons of getting of keeping drugs out. Or certainly curtailing it, but in other places not so much. Partly, I suppose, on the basis of their location. I mean, if unfortunately there's a public street right outside your prison, it's a bit easier for someone to use a catapult or a drone or whatever. I mean, we've seen them deal with there was a group that were doing drone drops into prisons. They seem to have, that's been taken into hand at this stage. There's people facing charges apparently on that. So, but there'll be another way. I mean, we've heard horrific stories of you know, vulnerable prisoners who've been allowed out in TR for a funeral, and they're pretty much forced to carry in their bodily orifices hundreds or, you know, amount of pills back in that'll then be distributed. I mean, the price of drugs is 3 times inside what it is out in the street. So it's a ready-made market for drug dealers, and it's something that's fought over. Yeah. And that's, you know, the cause of a lot of problem. Anything that's a currency within the jail, I mean, it's a potential for an issue between prisoners, and they've so many people that they need to keep apart. And you know, in terms of gangsters, people who are aligned to somebody else and not aligned to them. And then, as we know, as we've often talked about it here, you know, none of these gangs have strict membership rules. People float between different gangs. It's like, you know, you have a small core and different people that work as kind of subcontractors then that float in and out. So you have all this going on. Then on top of that, the vast majority of prisoners aren't involved in gangs. You know, they're people who've got addiction issues, or, you know, they've made a couple of bad decisions. They're not hardened criminals.
And they can be scared themselves in the environment.
And are extremely vulnerable and are there to be exploited by hardened criminals. So you have all this to balance, as well as, you know, you have some of these sex offenders and non-sex offenders who are extremely manipulative people who can't help themselves but try and, you know, force, you know, younger or dimmer or whatever it is, more vulnerable prisoners to do stuff for them.
Yeah, it certainly takes a certain personality, I'm sure, to juggle all that. And to it sounds even worse than the Sunday World having to. I have to hope to say that I'm
life
not going to be
sentence for us,
cancelled
Nicola.
for pointing out that a padded cell looked comfy.
We'll organise something for you. I'm sure they will. I'm sure Media House, I'm sure the people in Belgium will. They'll have something. There'll be a little mattress pod created for you.
Okay, Eamon, thank you.
You're welcome, Nicola.